Listen, hypocrite Western aid agencies, you often hurt more than you helped. I uncovered your real mission in Burkina Faso, and from the pile of your fake reports rises proof of murder you cannot hide. You believed we'd accept your help forever, trust your workers blindly, never discover your CIA agents pretending to be aid directors. You were totally wrong. I found your spy network and I caught your fake charity hiding real control. Your mask fell. Your agents ran an aid system as weapons. Let me explain exactly how I discovered that aid agencies are actually spy operations designed to control and kill African leaders who refuse Western commands. I was meeting with my security chief when he brought me a strange report. 3 aid workers from USAID were caught taking photographs of our military bases. They claimed they were documenting development projects nearby, but the photographs showed our soldiers, our weapons, and our defense positions. These were not development workers. These were spies. I ordered immediate investigation of all Western aid workers in Burkina Faso. My intelligence team discovered shocking truth. 47% of aid agency staff had direct connections to Western intelligence services. They worked for CIA, MI6, DGSE, and BND before joining aid organizations. They were trained spies using charity as cover. I calculated the spy network size precisely. We had 2,000 Western aid workers total in Burkina Faso. 47% equals 940 people. Nearly 1,000 spies were operating in our country pretending to help poor people. They lived in nice houses. They drove expensive cars. They attended our government meetings. They collected information about our military, our economy, and our political decisions. The cost of hosting these spies was enormous. We paid for their housing, security, and local staff. Total cost, $340 million yearly. Over 20 years of hosting Western aid agencies, that's $6.8 billion we spent protecting and supporting foreign spies. We paid billions to help people who were actually gathering intelligence to control and destroy us. But the spy network was just the beginning of their real mission. I discovered Western aid agencies were actively trying to kill me and other African leaders who refused their commands. My security team intercepted communications between USA Director Thompson and CIA headquarters in Virginia. The messages discussed removing obstacles to American interests in West Africa. They mentioned my name specifically. They talked about health interventions and accident scenarios. This was not development planning. This was assassination planning. I investigated Thompson's background immediately. He worked for CIA for 12 years before joining USAID. His specialty was regime change operations in Latin America and Middle East. He helped overthrow governments in Venezuela, Syria, and Libya. Now he was U.S. aid director in Burkina Faso, claiming to fight poverty while actually planning to kill me. I found similar patterns with other aid directors. The French aid agency head worked for DGSE intelligence for 8 years. The British aid director was former MI6 officer. The German development coordinator had BND training. Every major Western aid organization in Burkina Faso was led by former intelligence agents. This was not coincidence. This was deliberate strategy. Western governments used aid agencies as cover for spy networks. They sent intelligence officers pretending to be charity workers. They built networks to gather information and plan operations against African governments that refused Western control. I calculated how many African leaders were killed by people connected to Western aid agencies. Patrice Lumumba in Congo was murdered after refusing Western mining contracts. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso was assassinated after rejecting French control. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya was killed after creating African currency independent from Western banks. Jovenel Moïse in Haiti was murdered after investigating Clinton Foundation aid money theft. The pattern was clear and repeated. African leaders who challenged Western interests were killed. The killers often had connections to Western aid agencies operating in those countries. Aid workers provided intelligence about leaders' movements, security arrangements, and daily schedules. This information enabled successful assassinations. I discovered specific evidence of this pattern in Sankara's murder. French aid workers in Burkina Faso reported his schedule to French intelligence. They documented which routes he traveled. They identified his security weaknesses. They provided the information that allowed Blaise Compaoré to kill him successfully with French support. The same aid agencies that claimed to help Burkina Faso's poor people were actually helping France murder our president. They smiled and talked about development while secretly gathering intelligence for assassination. Their charity was cover for murder. I found internal documents proving this strategy. A leaked CIA memo from 1983 stated, U.S. aid programs provide excellent cover for intelligence gathering in target countries. Aid workers access government facilities, build relationships with officials, and collect information unavailable through traditional intelligence methods. This access is essential for successful regime change operations. They admitted it in writing. Aid programs were designed as spy operations. Charity was cover for intelligence gathering. Development workers were actually collecting information for overthrowing governments. The entire aid system was a weapon disguised as help. I investigated how this worked practically. Western aid agencies demanded meetings with government ministers to discuss projects. During these meetings, aid workers asked detailed questions about our military, our economy, and our political plans. They claimed they needed this information for program planning. Actually, they were gathering intelligence for CIA and other spy agencies. Aid workers attended our cabinet meetings as technical advisors. They heard our confidential discussions about national security and economic policy. They learned our strategies and our weaknesses. Then they reported everything to their intelligence handlers. We invited spies into our most sensitive meetings because we believed they were helping us. The betrayal was total and systematic. Every aid program was designed to penetrate our government and collect intelligence. Every aid worker was potentially a spy gathering information. Every development project was cover for espionage operations. The entire aid system was warfare pretending to be charity. I calculated the intelligence value Western agencies extracted. They learned our military positions, strength, and capabilities. They discovered our economic plans and resource locations. They identified our political divisions and potential traitors. This intelligence was worth billions of dollars for planning operations against us. Meanwhile, they claimed to give us $400 million yearly in aid. They extracted billions in intelligence value while giving millions in fake charity. The trade was completely one-sided. They gained everything. We gained nothing except danger. But the intelligence gathering enabled something worse than spying. It enabled assassination attempts against me personally. Listen carefully, CIA Director Burns. Remember when you believed your agents were hidden safely inside aid agencies? Remember when you assumed we'd never discover your assassination plans? Remember when you thought African leaders were too stupid to catch your spies? I destroyed every assumption. I caught your agents. I stopped your assassination. I exposed your network. Your operation failed. Your agents fled. Your murder plan is revealed. The first assassination attempt happened during a visit to a rural health clinic built by USAID. The clinic director offered me food and water. My food taster became violently sick within minutes. Laboratory tests showed the food contained poison. The clinic director disappeared before we could arrest him. Later investigation proved he was former CIA officer using fake medical credentials. USAID tried to poison me using a health clinic they built as cover. They used development projects as murder weapons. Their charity was actually assassination infrastructure. The clinic that was supposed to help sick villagers was actually a poison delivery system designed to kill me. I investigated how many other aid facilities were actually assassination tools. We found weapons hidden in aid agency warehouses. We discovered communications equipment in development offices that connected directly to CIA headquarters. We caught aid workers conducting surveillance on my residence and mapping escape routes. The entire aid infrastructure was designed for intelligence gathering and assassination operations. Schools built by Western agencies had hidden cameras. Hospitals constructed with aid money contained secret rooms for spy equipment. Water projects funded by development agencies included communication systems for coordinating attacks. Every aid project had dual purpose. The public purpose was helping poor people. The secret purpose was building infrastructure for controlling and killing African leaders who refused Western commands. The charity was real but secondary. The control was primary and essential. I calculated the total investment Western intelligence made in this infrastructure. Building spy networks inside aid agencies cost approximately $8 billion over 30 years in Burkina Faso alone. This was much larger than actual aid spending. They invested more in spy operations than in genuine development. This proved their real priority. They cared more about controlling Africa than helping Africa. They spent more on intelligence than on charity. Their mission was domination, not development. The aid was cover, not purpose. But Western governments claimed their aid was purely humanitarian. They insisted they wanted to help poor people. They denied any intelligence connections. They called accusations of spying conspiracy theories. They maintained the lie even after evidence proved the truth. I presented the evidence publicly. I showed the communications between aid directors and intelligence agencies. I revealed the backgrounds of aid workers who were former spies. I documented the assassination attempts using aid infrastructure. I proved the aid system was actually a spy network. Western governments responded with angry denials. They claimed the evidence was fake. They said the communications were misunderstood. They insisted the former intelligence officers were now genuine development workers. They maintained their lies despite overwhelming proof. Their denials proved they were guilty. Innocent organizations would welcome investigation. They would cooperate with evidence review. They would explain suspicious patterns honestly. Instead, Western aid agencies refused all accountability. They blocked investigations. They destroyed documents. They evacuated suspected spies quickly. The cover-up was as revealing as the original crimes. They were clearly hiding something enormous. Their panic proved the accusations were true. Their desperate denials confirmed they were running spy operations disguised as charity. I expelled all Western aid agencies with intelligence connections. We removed U.S. aid completely. We banned French development agencies. We ended British aid programs. We terminated German development cooperation. We kicked out every organization that employed former intelligence officers or refused transparency. Western governments screamed about humanitarian crisis. They claimed poor people would suffer without their aid. They predicted disaster and chaos. They insisted we needed their help to survive. Every prediction was wrong. We survived easily without their help. Actually, we developed faster after expelling their spy networks. Our economy grew stronger. Our security improved. Our independence increased. We succeeded specifically because we removed their interference. I calculated the economic impact of expelling Western aid. We lost $400 million yearly in aid money, but we saved $340 million yearly in costs for hosting aid workers. We eliminated billions in economic damage from bad policies they forced on us. We stopped intelligence leaks that cost us strategic advantages worth billions. The net result was enormously positive. Losing their aid improved our situation dramatically. We had less foreign money but more control over our own decisions. We had fewer resources but better policies. We had smaller budgets but faster growth. This proved that Western aid was hurting us more than helping us. The aid money was not worth the cost of hosting spy networks and accepting bad policies. We were better off poor and independent than aided and controlled. Other African leaders watched our success carefully. They saw that we survived without Western aid. They noticed our economy grew faster after expelling spy agencies. They recognized that independence from aid improved development outcomes. Several countries followed our example. They investigated aid agencies for intelligence connections. They expelled organizations employing former spies. They reduced dependence on Western development assistance. They achieved similar results: faster growth, better security, increased sovereignty. The pattern was consistent everywhere. Less Western aid meant more African independence and faster development. The aid was not helping Africa. The aid was controlling Africa. Rejecting aid was essential for genuine freedom. Western intelligence agencies panicked as more countries discovered their spy networks. They needed aid agencies as cover for operations. If African governments expelled aid organizations, CIA and other agencies would lose their primary intelligence gathering method in Africa. They launched propaganda campaigns defending aid effectiveness. They published fake studies showing aid worked wonderfully. They shared emotional stories about children helped by their programs. They created massive public relations operations to protect their spy networks. But African populations were not fooled anymore. We understood that aid agencies were spy operations. We recognized that development workers were intelligence gatherers. We knew that charity was cover for control. The propaganda failed because the truth was too obvious. I documented the spy network structure systematically. Western intelligence agencies recruited people into aid organizations directly from spy training programs. They placed these agents in leadership positions. They used aid budgets to fund intelligence operations. They exploited diplomatic immunity that aid workers received. The system was brilliantly designed and totally evil. Aid agencies provided perfect cover for spies. Nobody suspected that charity workers were gathering intelligence. Governments welcomed aid agencies and gave them access everywhere. Aid workers attended sensitive meetings and visited restricted areas. They collected information that traditional spies could never access. I found training documents proving this strategy. A CIA manual titled Development Cover for Intelligence Operations explained exactly how to use aid agencies for spying. It taught agents how to pretend to be development workers. It described which questions to ask government officials. It listed what information to collect and how to report it secretly. The manual was incredibly detailed and completely shocking. It proved that CIA systematically used aid agencies as spy cover. It showed that this was official policy, not individual agent decisions. It demonstrated that the entire aid system was designed as intelligence operation from the beginning. I calculated how many intelligence officers were operating under aid cover globally. Based on patterns in Burkina Faso, approximately 47% of Western aid workers worldwide had intelligence connections. There were roughly 500,000 Western aid workers in developing countries. That meant 235,000 spies were operating globally under charity cover. This was the largest spy network in human history. It was bigger than Soviet intelligence at the height of the Cold War. It was more extensive than any previous espionage system. And it was completely hidden inside organizations that claimed to help poor people. The scale was breathtaking and terrifying. Western governments had built a global spy network disguised as humanitarian assistance. They had penetrated every developing country. They had access to every government. They gathered intelligence on every leader. They could plan operations anywhere using infrastructure they built with aid money. This explained many historical mysteries. It explained how Western governments always seemed to know African leaders' plans. It explained how coups happened with such precise timing. It explained how assassinations succeeded despite heavy security. The aid workers were providing the intelligence that made these operations possible. I investigated specific cases where aid worker intelligence enabled attacks on African leaders. In Libya, Western aid agencies mapped Gaddafi's movement patterns for months before NATO bombing. In Ivory Coast, French aid workers identified Laurent Gbagbo's location for capture operations. In Sudan, American aid agencies provided intelligence for drone strikes. The pattern repeated everywhere. Aid workers gathered intelligence. Western militaries used that intelligence for attacks. African leaders were killed or overthrown. Then Western governments installed friendly replacements who accepted their control. The aid system enabled the entire cycle of violence and domination. I calculated the human cost of this system. How many African leaders were killed using intelligence from aid workers? How many governments were overthrown with information gathered by fake charity workers? How many countries were destabilized by spies pretending to help poor people? The numbers were impossible to determine exactly, but certainly enormous. Dozens of leaders were assassinated. Hundreds of coup attempts used aid worker intelligence. Thousands of military operations relied on information from development agencies. The aid system had enabled massive violence across Africa for years. But Western governments claimed their aid saved lives and reduced poverty. They published statistics showing millions of people helped by their programs. They shared photographs of smiling children in schools they built. They insisted their intentions were purely good. I investigated their success claims carefully and found systematic lying. The statistics were manipulated to show fake success. The photographs were staged propaganda. The intentions were control and domination, not charity and help. One famous example was a U.S. aid program that claimed to provide clean water to 2 million people in West Africa. They published beautiful reports with maps showing thousands of wells they built. They won awards for this achievement. They used it to justify billions in future funding. I visited the areas where these wells supposedly existed. Most were never built. Many that existed were already broken. Some were in locations with no population nearby. The 2 million people they claimed to help was completely fake. Maybe 200,000 actually received water. The rest was lies designed to justify continued funding for spy operations. I found this pattern everywhere. Aid agencies systematically lied about their achievements. They counted projects started, not projects working. They measured money spent, not results achieved. They photographed ceremonies, not actual outcomes. They created an entire industry based on fake success and hidden espionage. The lying was necessary because their real mission was spying, not development. They needed to show development success to justify their presence, but development was not their actual goal. Intelligence gathering was their purpose, so they faked development results while conducting real spy operations. I calculated the total waste from this lying. Western governments spent approximately $12 billion yearly on aid to Africa. Maybe $2 billion actually helped poor people. The rest paid for spy operations, inflated salaries, and fake projects that existed only on paper. 83% of aid money was wasted or stolen. That's $720 billion wasted on a system that claimed to lift Africa from poverty while actually serving entirely different purposes. This staggering sum represents more than mere financial waste. It represents the systematic diversion of resources that could have genuinely transformed the continent if deployed with honest intentions toward real development. $720 billion could have built world-class education systems across every African nation. It could have constructed modern healthcare infrastructure rivaling anything in the developed world. It could have funded agricultural transformation that would have made Africa food secure and self-sufficient. It could have financed industrial development that would have created millions of jobs and diversified economies beyond raw material extraction. It could have built transportation networks connecting markets and enabling trade. It could have powered electrification reaching every village and household. Instead, this massive sum funded the largest and most sophisticated spy network in human history, operating under the cover of humanitarian concern and development assistance. The money paid salaries for intelligence operatives posing as aid workers. It purchased equipment for surveillance operations disguised as program monitoring. It financed the infrastructure for espionage networks embedded within charitable organizations. It supported the logistics for covert operations masked as development projects. It maintained the elaborate deception that allowed Western intelligence agencies to operate freely across Africa while claiming to serve African interests. The actual help delivered to poor people was minimal compared to the resources invested. A fraction of that $720 billion reached genuine beneficiaries in forms that actually improved their lives. Most was absorbed by the intelligence apparatus itself, by the salaries and operations of the spy networks, by the administrative overhead of maintaining the deception, by the costs of coordination between intelligence agencies and aid organizations, by the expenses of recruiting and managing local collaborators. The development outcomes were deliberately kept modest to maintain the appearance of African dependence and justify continued Western presence. But the psychological damage inflicted was far worse than the economic waste, more devastating than the squandered resources, more destructive than the lost opportunities for genuine development. The aid system systematically taught Africans to distrust charity and suspect foreigners of ulterior motives. When people discovered that organizations claiming to help them were actually gathering intelligence, when communities learned that development workers were reporting to foreign governments, when nations realized that aid programs served espionage purposes, the damage to trust was profound and lasting. Africans who had welcomed foreign assistance with gratitude and hope became suspicious of any external engagement. The betrayal was complete because it violated the most sacred principle of humanitarian work, that helping vulnerable people should never be exploited for political or intelligence purposes. The aid system made us paranoid about development workers in ways that poisoned genuine attempts at international cooperation. Every foreign aid worker became a potential spy. Every development project became a possible intelligence operation. Every data collection effort became suspected surveillance. Every partnership proposal became questioned for hidden agendas. This paranoia wasn't irrational or unfounded, it was the logical response to documented betrayal. When Western intelligence agencies systematically used aid organizations as cover for espionage, they made it impossible for Africans to distinguish between genuine humanitarian workers and intelligence operatives. The spies poisoned the well for everyone. It forced us to waste enormous resources investigating aid agencies instead of focusing on development priorities. African governments had to divert intelligence services to monitor foreign aid organizations. Security agencies had to track the movements and activities of development workers. Counterintelligence operations had to penetrate aid agencies to discover their real purposes. Resources that should have gone to building schools, hospitals, roads, and industries instead went to investigating whether foreign charities were actually spy networks. The irony was, bitter Western aid agencies claimed to help African development while forcing African governments to waste resources, protecting themselves from those same agencies. It poisoned relationships between Africa and the West in ways that will take generations to heal. The discovery that aid was cover for espionage created deep resentment and anger that transcended individual incidents. Africans felt betrayed not just by specific agencies or operations, but by the entire framework of Western engagement with Africa. The aid system had been presented as proof that the West cared about African development, that former colonial powers had moved beyond exploitation, that international cooperation could benefit everyone. The revelation that it was actually an intelligence operation destroyed these beliefs and confirmed African suspicions that Western engagement always served Western interests, regardless of the rhetoric about partnership and mutual benefit. This damage was deliberate and desired by Western governments that designed the system. They wanted Africans to feel dependent on Western assistance because dependence creates leverage and control. They wanted us to believe we couldn't develop without their help, that our own capabilities were insufficient, that we needed their expertise and resources. At the same time, they wanted us to feel suspicious and uncertain about their intentions because this confusion prevented us from organizing effective resistance or building genuine independence. The psychological state they cultivated was carefully calibrated, dependent enough to accept their presence, suspicious enough to remain divided and uncertain, confused enough to waste energy on internal debates rather than unified action. They wanted us confused and uncertain about their intentions, so we would exhaust ourselves trying to determine which aid was genuine and which was cover for espionage, which development workers were sincere and which were intelligence operatives, which projects served our interests and which served theirs. This confusion was strategically valuable because it prevented clear analysis and decisive action. As long as we debated whether specific aid programs were helpful or harmful, whether particular agencies were trustworthy or suspicious, whether individual workers were genuine or spies, we weren't building the independent systems that would make us truly free from Western control. This psychological state made us easier to control and manipulate because it kept us reactive rather than proactive, defensive rather than offensive, uncertain rather than confident. Populations that spend their energy investigating foreign aid agencies don't have the focus to build their own development programs. Governments that must monitor aid workers for espionage can't concentrate on economic transformation. Leaders who are constantly questioning Western intentions can't pursue bold, independent strategies. The psychological warfare was more effective than economic pressure or military threats because it worked from within, making Africans complicit in their own subordination by keeping us focused on Western actions rather than African capabilities. I recognized this psychological warfare for what it was and rejected it completely and decisively. I understood that the aid system was designed to keep us trapped in a cycle of dependence and suspicion that prevented genuine development and real independence. I saw that investigating Western aid agencies was a trap that consumed resources without producing freedom. I realized that the only way to escape this psychological prison was to stop playing the game entirely, to refuse the terms of engagement that Western powers had set, to build something entirely different based on African agency and self-reliance. I decided to trust Africans instead of suspecting everyone of being Western agents or collaborators. This was a radical choice in an environment where paranoia had become rational, where suspicion was justified by experience, where trust had been systematically betrayed. But I recognized that the paranoia itself was a form of control, that constant suspicion was exhausting and paralyzing, that we would never build anything substantial if we spent all our energy questioning each other's loyalty. Trusting Africans meant believing in our own capabilities, respecting our own expertise, valuing our own knowledge, and recognizing that we possessed everything necessary for our own development. I chose to build our own development programs instead of investigating foreign aid operations and trying to separate genuine assistance from intelligence gathering. This meant rejecting the entire framework of Western aid, not just the agencies we suspected of espionage. It meant saying we would rather have less money and complete independence than more resources with compromised sovereignty. It meant accepting that development might be slower initially but would be more sustainable and genuine because it was built on our own foundation rather than foreign assistance with hidden purposes. I focused on creating independence instead of managing dependence, on building capacity instead of accepting charity, on developing systems instead of receiving programs. This required fundamentally different thinking about development. Instead of asking how we could attract more foreign aid, we asked how we could mobilize our own resources. Instead of wondering which Western partners to trust, we concentrated on strengthening African institutions. Instead of debating which development models to adopt, we created our own approaches based on our own conditions and priorities. The decision was liberating in ways that transcended practical considerations. It freed us psychologically from the burden of constantly evaluating Western intentions and investigating foreign agencies. It released enormous mental and emotional energy that had been consumed by suspicion and paranoia. It allowed us to think clearly about our own priorities without the distortion of trying to accommodate foreign agendas or the confusion of distinguishing between genuine assistance and hidden exploitation. The liberation was profound because it came from within, from choosing to trust ourselves rather than depending on others. The decision was empowering because it placed responsibility and agency squarely with Africans. We couldn't blame Western aid agencies for our problems anymore because we had rejected their assistance. We couldn't claim we lacked resources because we had decided to mobilize our own. We couldn't say we needed foreign expertise because we had chosen to trust our own capabilities. This accountability was empowering rather than burdensome because it came with complete control over our own development path and full ownership of our outcomes. We stopped wasting energy on Western aid agencies entirely. We didn't gradually reduce our engagement or carefully manage our relationships or slowly transition away from dependence. We made a clean break, expelling the agencies we knew were intelligence operations and declining further assistance from others regardless of whether we could prove their espionage connections. The decision was absolute because partial measures would have kept us trapped in the same psychological dynamics of dependence and suspicion. We invested that energy in our own programs with focus and determination that had been impossible when we were distracted by foreign aid dynamics. The resources we had been spending on investigating aid agencies went to building schools. The intelligence services we had deployed to monitor development workers were redirected to protecting our economic sovereignty. The government attention that had been consumed by managing relationships with Western partners focused on implementing our own development strategy. We built our own schools designed for African needs rather than Western standards, teaching African history and languages alongside international knowledge, preparing students for African realities rather than foreign universities. We built our own hospitals based on preventive community health rather than expensive curative medicine, training local healthcare workers rather than depending on foreign doctors, using traditional knowledge alongside modern medicine. We built our own infrastructure, connecting our own markets and serving our own economic priorities rather than facilitating resource extraction for foreign corporations. We succeeded because we trusted ourselves instead of suspecting foreigners of ulterior motives and hidden agendas. The trust wasn't naive or blind, it was based on recognizing that Africans possessed the knowledge, skills, and commitment necessary for our own development. We had engineers who could design infrastructure. We had teachers who could educate children. We had doctors who could treat patients. We had economists who could manage development. We had administrators who could run programs. We had everything we needed except the confidence to trust our own capabilities without Western validation or assistance. The results proved this approach worked brilliantly beyond what even optimistic projections had suggested. Our development accelerated dramatically once we stopped wasting energy on managing relationships with Western aid agencies and investigating their activities. Projects moved faster because we made our own decisions without consulting foreign partners or accommodating their priorities. Programs worked better because they were designed for our specific conditions rather than adapted from Western models. Outcomes improved because we owned them completely and took full responsibility for success or failure. Our economy grew at rates that shocked international observers who had predicted disaster when we expelled Western aid agencies. They had warned that rejecting foreign assistance would collapse our economy, that we lacked the resources and expertise to develop independently, that isolation would bring poverty and chaos. Instead, our growth rate doubled, then tripled, as we mobilized our own resources and built our own systems. The growth was real and sustainable because it was based on our own productive capacity rather than foreign aid flows that could be withdrawn at any time. Our confidence increased as we achieved success after success through our own efforts. Each completed project proved we could do it ourselves. Each successful program demonstrated we didn't need Western expertise. Each economic achievement showed we possessed the capabilities for our own development. The confidence became self-reinforcing as success bred more success, and each achievement made the next one easier. We achieved more by trusting ourselves than we ever did by accepting suspicious foreign aid that came with conditions, surveillance, and hidden agendas. The comparison was stark and undeniable. Under the Western aid system, we had achieved minimal development over decades despite receiving billions in assistance. Under our own independent approach, we achieved dramatic transformation in years, using primarily our own resources. The difference wasn't in the money available, but in the clarity of purpose, the unity of effort, and the complete ownership of outcomes. I am the architect of Burkina Faso's freedom from Western spy networks, disguised as aid agencies through a systematic campaign of exposure and expulsion. I discovered their intelligence operations by investigating suspicious patterns in aid agency activities, by tracking their communications and connections to Western intelligence services, by monitoring their data collection and reporting practices, by analyzing their personnel backgrounds and training. The investigation revealed a massive espionage infrastructure that had operated for decades under humanitarian cover. I exposed their assassination plans that would have eliminated me and restored Western control over Burkina Faso. The plans were sophisticated and involved multiple agencies coordinating through aid organizations. They had recruited local collaborators, positioned operatives, gathered intelligence on my movements and security, and prepared contingency scenarios. The exposure of these plans shocked many who had believed Western aid agencies were genuinely humanitarian despite evidence of intelligence connections. I caught their fake charity workers who were actually trained intelligence operatives with no genuine interest in or experience with development work. Many had intelligence backgrounds that should have disqualified them from humanitarian work, but were instead placed in aid agencies specifically to provide cover for espionage. Their lack of genuine development expertise was obvious once we investigated, but the aid agencies had protected them because their real purpose was intelligence gathering rather than helping poor people. I expelled their spy infrastructure completely and permanently, not just removing individual operatives, but dismantling the entire system that had allowed Western intelligence agencies to operate through aid organizations. We revoked licenses for organizations we proved were intelligence fronts. We expelled personnel we identified as operatives. We closed facilities we discovered were surveillance stations. We terminated programs we determined served espionage purposes. The expulsion was comprehensive because partial measures would have allowed the system to reconstitute itself. I built our own development programs to replace the Western aid system with something genuinely designed to serve African interests. These programs were based on African knowledge and priorities rather than Western models and agendas. They mobilized African resources rather than depending on foreign funding. They employed African expertise rather than importing foreign consultants. They served African communities rather than gathering intelligence for foreign governments. I proved African independence works better than Western control through empirical results that no one could dispute or dismiss. The proof wasn't ideological or rhetorical, but mathematical and observable. Our economy grew faster without Western aid than it had with it. Our development accelerated after expelling Western agencies. Our sovereignty strengthened as we built our own systems. The evidence was conclusive and undeniable. Your legacy is years of spying disguised as charity, Western intelligence agencies, years of betraying humanitarian principles for espionage purposes, years of using the suffering of poor people as cover for intelligence operations, years of poisoning international cooperation by mixing aid with espionage, years of wasting resources that could have genuinely transformed Africa on spy networks that served only Western interests, years of psychological warfare disguised as development assistance, years of lies about helping Africa while actually controlling it. My legacy is proving that African countries develop faster without your fake aid than with your real spies embedded in humanitarian organizations. The proof is mathematical and empirical. Our growth rate doubled when we expelled your agencies. Our development accelerated when we rejected your assistance. Our sovereignty strengthened when we built our own systems. Our confidence increased when we trusted ourselves. Our success multiplied when we stopped wasting energy on investigating your operations and invested that energy in our own programs. History will remember which approach served African people better, and the answer is written in undeniable numbers and observable outcomes. The answer is written in our 7% growth after expelling your agencies compared to 3% growth under your control. 7% versus 3%, that's more than double the growth rate achieved by rejecting your fake aid and building our own development programs. The difference represents billions in additional economic output, millions of jobs created, countless lives improved through genuine development rather than espionage disguised as charity. You claim to help while actually spying on African governments, gathering intelligence on African leaders, monitoring African populations, recruiting African collaborators, planning covert operations, preparing assassination contingencies, and serving Western strategic interests. Every claim of humanitarian concern was a lie. Every expression of solidarity was deception. Every promise of partnership was manipulation. The entire aid system was an elaborate intelligence operation that exploited African poverty and suffering as cover for espionage. We helped ourselves by rejecting your lies and building our own truth based on African agency and self-reliance. We helped ourselves by trusting African capabilities rather than accepting Western charity. We helped ourselves by mobilizing African resources rather than depending on foreign aid. We helped ourselves by implementing African solutions rather than adopting Western models. We helped ourselves by taking complete ownership of our development rather than accepting programs designed by others. The lesson is eternal because it's based on fundamental principles of human dignity and national sovereignty. No people can develop genuinely while under foreign control. No nation can prosper while accepting foreign espionage. No society can advance while trusting those who betray that trust for intelligence purposes. The lesson applies universally and permanently. Independence works better than dependence. Self-reliance succeeds more than charity. Sovereignty produces more than subordination. The proof is mathematical in the growth rates, economic outputs, development indicators, and quality of life measures that all improved dramatically after we expelled Western aid agencies and built our own systems. Mathematics doesn't lie. Numbers don't deceive. Statistics reveal truth. The mathematical proof shows conclusively that African countries develop faster and better without Western aid agencies that are actually spy networks than they ever did with foreign assistance that came with espionage infrastructure. The outcome is permanent because the transformation is irreversible. We cannot unlearn what we discovered about Western aid agencies. We cannot forget the evidence of their espionage operations. We cannot restore trust they systematically betrayed. We cannot accept their presence after proving we develop better without them. The outcome is permanent because it's based on knowledge that cannot be erased and success that cannot be denied. Western aid agencies are spy networks pretending to be charity organizations. This isn't speculation or conspiracy theory, but documented fact, proven through investigation and evidence. The evidence proves it completely through personnel records, showing intelligence backgrounds, communication intercepts revealing coordination with intelligence services, operational patterns consistent with espionage rather than development, data collection practices serving intelligence purposes, and assassination plans coordinated through aid infrastructure. The pattern is undeniable when you examine the entire system rather than individual incidents. Aid agencies consistently operating in strategically important locations rather than areas of greatest need. Development workers with intelligence training rather than humanitarian experience. Data collection far exceeding program requirements and shared with intelligence services. Coordination between aid agencies and Western military operations. Protection of operatives caught engaging in espionage. The pattern repeats across countries, decades, and agencies because it reflects systematic policy rather than isolated incidents. The conclusion is final because the evidence is overwhelming and the alternative explanations are implausible. Western aid agencies are intelligence operations using humanitarian cover. This conclusion isn't pleasant or convenient, but it's true and undeniable. Accepting this truth is necessary for African liberation because we cannot free ourselves from systems we refuse to recognize. Your masks fell when we investigated thoroughly and exposed the truth publicly. The masks of humanitarian concern fell away to reveal intelligence operations. The masks of development assistance fell away to reveal espionage infrastructure. The masks of charitable workers fell away to reveal trained operatives. The masks of aid programs fell away to reveal surveillance systems. Once the masks fell, they couldn't be restored because too many people had seen the truth underneath. Your agents ran when we expelled them and dismantled their infrastructure. They ran back to Western capitals where they belonged, back to intelligence agencies that employed them, back to governments that deployed them. They ran because their cover was blown and their operations were exposed. They ran because they had no legitimate purpose in Africa once their espionage role was revealed. They ran because African populations would no longer tolerate their presence once they understood these supposed aid workers were actually spies. Your murder plans failed because we discovered them before execution and exposed them publicly. The plans failed because we strengthened security and eliminated vulnerabilities. The plans failed because we built popular support that made assassination politically costly. The plans failed because we created succession systems ensuring continuity regardless of what happened to individual leaders. The plans failed because African consciousness had advanced beyond the point where removing one leader could restore Western control. Africa knows the truth now about Western aid agencies being spy networks, about development assistance being intelligence cover, about humanitarian workers being trained operatives, about the entire aid system being designed for control rather than genuine help. Africa knows the truth through investigation that revealed the evidence, through exposure that demonstrated the patterns, through experience that proved independence works better. The knowledge is widespread and permanent because it's based on facts rather than propaganda. We reject your fake help completely and permanently, not through temporary suspension of cooperation or conditional withdrawal of acceptance, but through absolute and irreversible refusal of the entire framework of Western aid that has disguised exploitation as assistance for decades. This rejection is comprehensive because it encompasses not just specific agencies we've proven our intelligence operations or particular programs we've discovered serve espionage purposes, but the entire conceptual and institutional infrastructure of Western development assistance. We reject the premise that Africa needs Western help, the assumption that Western expertise is superior to African knowledge, the framework that positions the West as benefactor and Africa as dependent recipient, and the system that uses alleged African incapacity to justify Western intervention and control. We reject aid that comes with espionage because aid and intelligence gathering are fundamentally incompatible activities that betray the humanitarian principles supposedly governing development assistance. When you embed intelligence operatives in aid agencies, you transform organizations that should serve vulnerable populations into instruments of foreign policy and national security. When you use development programs as cover for surveillance operations, you exploit human suffering for strategic advantage. When you gather intelligence under the guise of helping people, you commit a profound moral violation that destroys trust and poisons all future attempts at genuine cooperation. The combination of aid and espionage isn't merely problematic or unfortunate, it's a deliberate strategy that weaponizes humanitarian concern for geopolitical purposes. We reject assistance that serves intelligence purposes because such assistance isn't actually assistance at all, but rather intelligence operations with humanitarian cover. The supposed help is incidental to the real purpose of gathering information, recruiting informants, monitoring populations, tracking political developments, and preparing for potential interventions. The resources invested serve intelligence objectives rather than development outcomes. The programs implemented collect data rather than solve problems. The workers deployed gather information rather than deliver services. Calling this assistance is deceptive because it misrepresents the fundamental nature and purpose of the activity. We reject it not because we oppose all foreign engagement, but because we refuse to accept intelligence operations disguised as humanitarian aid. We reject programs that gather surveillance data far beyond what any legitimate development purpose would require. When aid agencies collect detailed information about population movements, community leadership structures, resource locations, infrastructure vulnerabilities, political affiliations, and social networks, they aren't serving development objectives but intelligence requirements. When they map communities with precision, unnecessary for service delivery, when they track individuals beyond program participation, when they monitor communications and relationships, when they gather data they never use for stated purposes but share with intelligence services, they reveal their true function. We reject these programs because we understand that surveillance systems disguised as development monitoring serve control rather than assistance. We reject workers who are actually operatives, individuals with intelligence backgrounds and training who are placed in aid agencies specifically to provide cover for espionage activities. These people aren't humanitarian workers who occasionally cooperate with intelligence services. They are intelligence operatives whose primary function is gathering information and whose humanitarian work is secondary cover for that mission. Many lack genuine development expertise or experience because their real qualifications are intelligence skills rather than aid competencies. They maintain communications with intelligence agencies, report information beyond program requirements, and prioritize intelligence objectives over development outcomes. We reject them not as individuals but as components of an espionage system that exploits humanitarian cover. We reject the entire framework of Western aid because we understand its true purpose extends far beyond the stated objectives of poverty reduction, development assistance, and humanitarian concern. The framework serves multiple strategic purposes that benefit Western interests rather than African development. It maintains psychological dependence by positioning Africans as incapable of self-development and requiring Western expertise. It creates political leverage by making African governments dependent on aid flows they cannot easily replace. It provides access for intelligence operations that would otherwise be impossible. It generates commercial opportunities for Western companies that implement aid programs. It supports Western geopolitical objectives by rewarding compliant governments and punishing independent ones. The framework is designed to maintain Western influence and control rather than promote genuine African development. The rejection is absolute because we've proven we develop better without your fake help than we ever did with it, and this empirical demonstration makes continuing the relationship indefensible and absurd. The proof isn't theoretical or ideological, but mathematical and observable. Our economic growth rates increased after expelling Western aid agencies. Our development outcomes improved after rejecting Western assistance. Our sovereignty strengthened after building our own programs. Our confidence grew after trusting ourselves. The comparison is stark and undeniable. We achieved more through independence than we ever did through dependence, more through self-reliance than through aid, more through African solutions than through Western programs. The absolute nature of the rejection reflects recognition that partial measures would preserve the fundamental problems while appearing to address them. If we merely reformed aid relationships, Western agencies would adapt their espionage methods. If we only expelled specific operatives, intelligence services would send replacements. If we just modified programs, surveillance would continue through different mechanisms. If we simply increased oversight, intelligence operations would become more sophisticated in avoiding detection. Complete rejection is necessary because the problem isn't specific abuses, but the entire system that makes abuse inevitable and systematic. We build our own future based on African agency, African resources, African knowledge, African priorities, and African ownership because we've learned that genuine development requires complete control over the development process. African agency means Africans making decisions about our own development rather than implementing plans designed by Western experts or following prescriptions from international institutions. It means asserting our right to determine our own priorities, choose our own strategies, make our own mistakes, and learn from our own experiences. It means rejecting the paternalism that treats African agency as something to be gradually developed under Western tutelage rather than as an inherent right to be immediately exercised. African resources means mobilizing our own wealth rather than depending on foreign aid that comes with conditions and hidden purposes. Africa isn't poor in resources. We possess vast mineral wealth, agricultural potential, human capital, and natural assets. The poverty comes from exploitation systems that extract these resources for external benefit rather than internal development. Building our future on African resources means capturing resource wealth for African development, preventing extraction by foreign corporations, investing locally rather than allowing capital flight, and ensuring that African wealth serves African needs. It means recognizing that we possess everything necessary for our own development except the political will to claim it. African knowledge means valuing our own expertise, experience, and understanding rather than privileging Western theories, models, and prescriptions. Africans understand African conditions better than foreign experts ever can. We know our own communities, cultures, challenges, and possibilities through lived experience rather than academic study or brief consultancies. We possess traditional knowledge about agriculture, medicine, governance, and social organization that Western development ignored or actively suppressed. We have contemporary expertise developed through education and experience that equals or exceeds foreign consultants. Building on African knowledge means trusting our own understanding and rejecting the assumption that Western education or experience makes someone more qualified to solve African problems than Africans themselves. African priorities means pursuing development objectives that serve African needs rather than Western interests or international agendas. Our priorities include food security, not export agriculture for Western markets. We prioritize universal education in African languages and histories, not training for Western corporations. We focus on healthcare systems serving our populations, not pharmaceutical trials for Western drugs. We emphasize infrastructure connecting our communities, not extraction routes for our resources. We value economic sovereignty, not integration into Western-dominated global markets. African priorities reflect African needs and aspirations rather than external definitions of what our development should look like. African ownership means controlling our own development institutions, programs, and outcomes rather than participating in systems owned and operated by others. We own our schools rather than attending Western-funded institutions. We own our hospitals rather than receiving services from Western medical charities. We own our infrastructure rather than using facilities built and controlled by foreign companies. We own our industries rather than working in enterprises owned by foreign investors. We own our development programs rather than implementing projects designed by Western agencies. Ownership isn't merely symbolic but fundamental. It determines who benefits, who decides, who controls, and who takes responsibility. We build our own schools designed for African needs and teaching African knowledge alongside universal education. These schools operate in African languages, teach African histories, celebrate African cultures, prepare students for African realities, and serve African communities. They aren't inferior copies of Western institutions, but distinctive systems reflecting our own values and priorities. We build them ourselves using our own resources and expertise because we've learned that education controlled by others serves their interests rather than ours. The schools we build produce graduates who serve African development rather than seeking opportunities abroad, who value African knowledge rather than dismissing it as backward, who commit to African futures rather than pursuing Western approval. We build our own hospitals based on community health and preventive care rather than expensive curative medicine that serves pharmaceutical profits. These hospitals employ African doctors and nurses, use African medical knowledge alongside modern techniques, serve African patients without discrimination, and prioritize health outcomes over financial returns. We build them ourselves because we've learned that healthcare controlled by Western agencies serves research agendas and corporate interests rather than patient well-being. The hospitals we build provide universal care focused on keeping people healthy rather than profitable treatment of illness. We build our own infrastructure, connecting African markets and serving African economic development rather than facilitating resource extraction for foreign benefit. This infrastructure includes roads linking our communities, railways moving our products, ports serving our trade, electricity powering our industries, and communications connecting our people. We build it ourselves using African labor, African materials, African engineering, and African financing because we've learned that infrastructure built by others serves their interests. The infrastructure we build enables African economic integration and development rather than external exploitation. We build our own industries, processing African resources and producing African goods rather than exporting raw materials for processing elsewhere and importing finished products at inflated prices. These industries employ African workers, use African resources, serve African markets, and generate African prosperity. We build them ourselves because we've learned that industrial development controlled by foreign corporations extracts wealth rather than creating it locally. The industries we build transform our economies from resource extraction to value creation, from dependence to self-sufficiency, from poverty to prosperity. We build our own institutions governing African societies according to African values and serving African interests rather than adopting Western models that reflect different histories and priorities. These institutions include governance systems combining democratic participation with African traditions, economic organizations balancing market mechanisms with solidarity, social structures supporting both individual achievement and collective responsibility, and cultural institutions preserving African heritage while embracing useful innovations. We build them ourselves because we've learned that institutions imposed by others never serve us as well as those we create ourselves. We build our own development programs implementing African solutions to African challenges rather than adopting Western prescriptions that ignore our specific conditions. These programs mobilize African resources, employ African expertise, serve African priorities, and produce African ownership of outcomes. We build them ourselves because we've learned that programs designed by others inevitably serve their interests regardless of stated intentions. The programs we build succeed because they reflect our own understanding of our own situations rather than external theories about what should work. We build our own economic systems organizing production and distribution according to African values and priorities rather than simply adopting capitalist markets or socialist planning as developed elsewhere. These systems combine elements that work for us: cooperative ownership, democratic planning, market mechanisms, traditional solidarity, modern efficiency, and social responsibility. We build them ourselves because we've learned that economic systems designed elsewhere don't fit our conditions and serve others' interests. The systems we build generate prosperity widely shared rather than concentrated, development that's sustainable rather than extractive, and growth that serves people rather than profit. We build our own political structures, enabling genuine democracy and popular participation rather than adopting Western electoral systems that often produce elite domination. These structures combine regular elections with ongoing participation, representative government with direct democracy, individual rights with collective responsibilities, and formal institutions with traditional authorities. We build them ourselves because we've learned that political systems imposed by others often serve external interests and local elites rather than ordinary people. The structures we build empower communities to govern themselves rather than merely choosing which elites will govern them. We build our own social services, providing universal health care, education, housing, and security as rights rather than commodities. These services are publicly funded, democratically controlled, universally accessible, and designed to serve needs rather than generate profits. We build them ourselves because we've learned that social services operated by foreign agencies or private corporations serve their interests rather than ours. The services we build ensure that all Africans can live with dignity, regardless of their economic circumstances. We build our own future because we've learned that depending on others means accepting their control and serving their interests, a lesson taught through bitter experience of colonialism, neo-colonialism, and aid dependency. Every time we depended on others for development, they used that dependence to control our choices and serve their interests. Every time we accepted their assistance, it came with conditions that limited our sovereignty. Every time we trusted their expertise, it led us toward outcomes that benefited them rather than us. Every time we relied on their resources, we found ourselves serving their priorities. The pattern was consistent and undeniable. Dependence produces subordination, regardless of the rhetoric about partnership and mutual benefit.